Thank you, Jason. All right, how many of you were here back in June when I spoke the first time? Oh, good news for you, that's the same slide, so the test will be easier for you this time. So it's good to be back here talking to you again. I'm sorry that Yolanda couldn't be here. She's much prettier than I am, but let's talk about the cascading effect. How many of you out there feel that right now, today, you could protect your networks all by yourself? How many of you trust every vendor, every supplier, every device that's on your network? How many of you used to just do IT security and now you're IT and OT security? Anybody? Did you get more budget when that happened? No, you never do. You're always given more to protect and less to do it with. Jason just talked about all the IoT coming online, right? Whose job is it to protect that? We're automating more and more processes every day, and yet we're seeing the same budget and the same group of people. You now have to worry about, alarm systems on your OT systems as well as all of your alerts on your IT systems. You have the same staff working through all of that, right? That's the world that we live in. And then you're getting calls from your vendors, your suppliers saying that, hey, you need to update this, you need to patch that, or we think we have some, malicious activity on our side of the network. You protect yourself. You're all in constant communication with your vendors and suppliers, right? Upstream and downstream. Yeah. It's the world that we live in. We're still living in this antiquated model where we think we need to do everything by ourselves. We don't need to talk to anybody else. And that's the domino effect. Whether you call it the domino effect, the shock wave, the ripple effect, or my personal favorite, the cascading parade of failure. When one thing goes wrong, everything seems to go wrong, right? And we're going to put that kind of into context with the Colonial Pipeline. Because the Colonial Pipeline, they thought that because they had OT and IT systems, that even if something happened to their IT network, it wouldn't impact their OT network. And the pipeline runs on their OT, right? How many of you think you could keep running your OT if your IT systems go down? Well, a lot of people still think that they could, and Colonial Pipeline was definitely in that bucket. They move gasoline, home heating oil, and aviation fuel, and this will all become important later. This is how it cascaded. But on May 7th in 2021, DarkSide hit them with a ransomware attack. Now, we also like to point out that they stole 100 gigs of data from them, as well as hitting them with ransomware. So that's part of what we're looking at these days is extortionware to go with the ransomware. They're going to steal the data from you first, and then they're going to tell you, hey, even if you don't pay us the ransom for getting your systems back, you need to pay us the ransom so we don't release this data publicly. How many of you are regulated? How many of you, if your information got out, it'd be a reputation hit, a financial hit, or a regulatory hit to you? Yeah, that's what they're looking at. They're trying to hit you from both directions, trying to give you every reason to pay the ransom. And that's what happened here is $4.4 million in ransom was paid. And you can see that the quote here is, I didn't make it lightly. I admit that I wasn't comfortable seeing money go out the door to people like this, but it was the right thing to do for the country. That's the CEO of Colonial Pipeline. You notice he didn't say it's the right thing to do for Colonial Pipeline, right? It's the right thing to do for the country. Because internally they might have a process that says, hey, we will never pay a ransom, and this is how we're going to do things. But their vendors, their suppliers, their customers, and even the federal government was like, you need to make this right, and you need to do it right now because everybody depends on you. Everything from military bases to airlines, and that's the cascading effect. But let's look at this in a little more detail. The threat actors actually got into the network on April the 29th. 10 days inside the network. What could you do in 10 days? Yeah, you could do a lot. Now, if the log files, which is one of the things that got hit, were the first thing that they hit with ransomware, how would you figure out what somebody did for 10 days in your network? If you don't have access to log files, would you know what was going on? And that's kind of what happened to Colonial Pipeline, is all of their health and safety systems are on the IT side of the house, but they work for the OT side of the house. So all that 5,000 miles of pipeline, and they didn't have people sitting at every substation to look at all those things on the substation, all those alarms, all those sensors, everything reports back to the IT side. Without the IT side, they didn't know the health and safety of the pipeline. That was the connection point right there. And without those sensors, they couldn't guarantee that the pipeline was safe to operate, so they had to shut it down. Now, the way that the bad guys got in was through a compromised VPN password. And the funny thing here is that the employee that had that VPN password no longer even worked for the company. This was the thing is that a lot of times in the IT, OT world is that you don't always have one account that you can go in and delete that account when an employee is gone. He might have accounts on all these other different systems throughout your network. How do you ensure that that person is taken care of? In this particular case, this particular user, we don't know which, but he was reusing his password. His password was actually compromised, whether it was his Gmail, Netflix, or whatever account. He was using the same password there as he was for his VPN password. The bad guys is actually compromised, or it was part of a large group compromise, and they were just saying, hey, let's try all these passwords against places where every place where this person has ever worked, and they got in. How many of you would bet your job that your employees are not using their Netflix passwords as the password for your organization? I never have any hands go up on that one. Well, I did once because it was a one-person shop, but that's... Multi-factor authentication was not used. So multi-factor authentication could have stopped this at this point in time anyway. So this is what we're looking at for a cascading effect. We're looking at the pipeline is a transportation system. And the pipeline was hit, so the pipeline is not able to transport anything, which means that energy is not getting where it needs to go. This meant that fuel, whether it be gasoline or aviation fuel, was not getting to the people that needed it. So that meant airplanes couldn't go up in the air, right? We live in an on-demand society. How many of you remember those large bollards that used to sit out at airports, full of fuel? Anybody? Am I just that old? Well, we don't have those anymore. Most airlines only have 1 or 2 days worth of fuel. Those things were very expensive to maintain. They were an environmental hazard, so they got rid of them when the pipelines came in because fuel is delivered on demand now. So with the pipeline being down and as the days stretched into weeks on that, they couldn't put planes in the air. Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world, couldn't put planes in the air. Do you think that caused a problem? Every other airport across the country had to start taking overflow. Or Atlanta could say, hey, I can get, instead of going all the way from Atlanta to Hawaii, I can get you to LA, and then LA, can you refuel them? And LA's like, well, we don't have enough runways for all the planes you're sending our way. Same thing in Seattle, same thing in, all the way up the East Coast and West Coast. So our transportation sector was hit, but not just on the airline side. It was also hit on the emergency services side. You couldn't put ambulances on the road. It was hurricane season was just beginning and stuff like that. So you had all these emergency services that worried about, once again, on-demand fuel. How do we react to emergencies if we don't have enough gas to get us there? At the same time, we didn't have enough hazardous material drivers because guess what was going on at the same time? This is the pandemic. And would you rather drive for Amazon not driving gasoline or flammable liquid, making more money, or would you rather drive flammable liquids? So a lot of these people were shifting over and driving for these other FedEx, Amazon, UPS. And so we had that going on. So the only place left, we had to pull hazardous material drivers from the chemical sector and the critical manufacturing sector in order to start meeting the fuel demands. So they couldn't deliver their chemicals, their critical manufacturing, because their drivers were being diverted. And we could keep following this rabbit all the way down that hole until all 16 sectors are impacted, all from one ransomware attack. How many of you have done the exercise where you sit down and said, if I didn't have access to X, could I still do business? Or, if I'm impacted, who can't do business because I'm down? Have you ever looked at things from that way? Who would you impact and who impacts you? That's the communication lines that we're trying to ask you to start making. Are you talking to those people? Because this is what happened with Colonial Pipeline. We had the airline schedules changed. We had hazardous material drivers diverted. I love these pictures here. How many of you know that gasoline, if you inhale too much of it, you'll pass out, right? And so you think that those nice plastic bags, those were keeping the fumes in the cars, right? These are real pictures. These are actual things that law enforcement sent to us of people doing. And yes, there were actually people that were putting these in their cars, then passing out at the wheel of their car, causing accidents, which guess what? You had to send an ambulance out for, which you didn't have gas for. So it's just compounding it. You never know how the people are going to react. But you had states of emergency, all throughout the Southeast here, all because of one cyber attack. And yes, we even had to put out the Consumer Product Safety Commission advisory on fuel safety. So don't transport it in plastic bags. But think about your own supply chain. Think about how would you react if it's a vendor, whether it be SolarWinds, whether it be Microsoft, whether it be Amazon Cloud Services. Vendors and suppliers, Would it impact your quality of what you're putting out? Would it impact your logistics? How do you get in raw materials? What about your deadlines? What about your reputation? The number one thing when I go into most organizations, they're willing to take a financial hit because a financial hit's a one-time thing usually, but a reputational hit, companies don't want a reputational hit. How would your reputation be impacted from something that you probably had no control over? No matter how good your cybersecurity program is, if somebody along your supply chain gets hit, it causes you not to be able to do your job. Are you prepared for that? And then what about the reputations of the people that you support? What if they blame you for what's going on with them? How are you able to keep your schedules, meet your deadlines? So going back to kind of how this all started with Sid and his talk, most organizations are really good at knowing when there's a problem, and they're also very good at the other end of the spectrum of recovering from a disaster. It's everything in the middle that gets a little fuzzy, right? So most organizations have to wait for a problem to become a disaster before they know what to do with it. Well, the big thing for you today is that you need to worry about event management and incident management so that you can perform business continuity, so that you can identify or detect when something bad is happening, and then you can start to respond to it immediately so you can keep yourself up and operational. Whether that's moving over to the old method of doing things, pen and paper, or having those countermeasures in place, working with your vendors and suppliers, having alternate vendors and suppliers, being able to be agile during your operations. So that being said, I'd like to say that this is Jason and I'm Klint. We're from the federal government and we're here to help. So I obviously didn't do a good enough job back in June because I didn't have a whole lot of you reaching out to us, but we're really here to help and we're really here to talk to you about how we can help you. We have a lot of services that we can bring to bear for you. Most of them just involve giving Jason or myself or Yolanda a call and saying, hey, we do really need your help. Even if it's just a talk, we can do things off the record. We can come in and just talk to you, say, hey, these are the services we provide. Is there anything that we can do for you? Because the threat actors are targeting everybody. We're no longer looking at individual attacks, we're looking at ecosystems attack. How many of you have heard that there's a Russian group right now that's targeting healthcare? Yeah, and that's just the start of it. We've already had threat actors saying they're going to target cloud services. They're going to target the financial industry. The nice thing about this current one is they're actually sitting on a list and saying, here's exactly who we're going to attack. It'd be nice if all the threat actors did that, would send us the list ahead of time, kind of like the NFL schedule, what they do. But this is what we have here today, is that we have our cyber resilience review, our external dependency management assessment, and our cyber infrastructure survey. Jason and I would be happy to come on site or to work with you virtually in order to tell you more about those. Those are on-site assessments where we come in and walk you through your security program. We talk to you about how you form relationships with your external dependencies. We help build a roadmap. We're not there to judge you. We're there to help you see what resources you have and where do you have those allocated. Are they really allocated where you want to be? Do you have a path forward? That's what we're here for. And then, of course, we have the Cybersecurity Evaluation Toolkit. For those of you who don't want to work directly with Jason and myself, you can download this nice toolkit, and then you can have it, and all the things that we do for you there, you can have it all in one toolkit for you to do self-assessments. I do highly suggest inviting us out to do the assessments with you first, because there's a lot of the questions, we can explain them much better than the toolkit does, and we can work you through that. But the toolkit does exist. It's a great repository of all kinds of things in there. And the very last thing we'll touch on is the vulnerability, or what we used to call our cyber hygiene program, is we can offer you vulnerability scanning on your IT side of the house and your application side of the house. And those are set up to be monthly scans for you, and we can get those set up usually pretty quickly. So Jason, did you want to say anything before we ended?
Thank you.
We're going to take questions now, I think, from you if you have any, because we have, yep. If you don't have any questions, then I'm just going to ramble on about the various things that pop into my head. Yes, sir.
I'm Larry with ARC. It seems to me that information sharing is kind of an issue in the industry right now, right? There's a lot of incidents that happen, but people don't share information about those incidents. Are there any initiatives to create any additional information sharing between end users or anything like that?
Well, if we keep creating more tools for there to be information sharing, there's going to be so many that the information is not going to get shared. But I mean, between all the ISACs out there, all the ISAOs that are out there, so the information sharing analysis communities, information sharing analysis organizations, you know, we've got the FBI, we've got CISA. I mean, that's what we exist for, is for you to tell us in a non-attribution format, hey, Clint, this is what's happening, guys, can you please get the word out? That's what we do. That's what all those alerts that we put out there for, is we really are that repository. We take that job very seriously. And those avenues already exist. People just need to use them, whether it's your ISAC, your ISAO, us, or the FBI, or anybody else. Just start talking to each other. There's ways to do it in a non-attribution format if you're worried about, once again, that reputational hit. Jason, you have anything?
I think you covered it.
Yeah. I mean, that's really what we're here for, is to help you get the information out. The more people that tell us stuff, the more information we can get out, and we can make it actionable. That has been our number one goal ever since we split apart from DHS to become CISA. Our number one goal is to say, hey, it's more than just about pushing information out. It's pushing out actionable information. And that's what we strive to do, but we can only do that with your help. Any other questions?
Oh, can you use the microphone?
Incident within 24 hours after they know it, right? And I know that in the US, that's not really the kind of mindset, but do you think that is kind of forced? You have to report an incident 24 hours after you detect it. I mean, will also be something in the end in America to just make sure people can react?
So I always like to say this, is that we are at the tipping point right now, is that up until this point, it's all been voluntary. Self-reporting has been voluntary, but if people don't start self-reporting voluntary, it has to become regulatory. Believe it or not, the federal government does not like to be in the regulatory business. But we are so dependent on our critical infrastructure, and of course, everything in critical infrastructure runs on cyber these days, that if you don't start self-reporting voluntarily, it's going to have to be regulated. You've already seen, because of the Colonial Pipeline incident, pipelines are now regulated. And it's going to start pushing out to every other critical infrastructure if people don't start communicating either with each other or with us, so that we can start taking action. And we can make sure there's only ever one patient zero. Only one person has to be hit before everybody else is ready to protect themselves. Sometimes you have to take one for the team. So,
Yeah, so from a U.S. perspective, the other thing that's going to happen potentially later this year is the SEC is going to have some reporting requirements for cybersecurity. So one of the questions that I have is, how do we, for the global integrated companies that some of us work for, how do we understand all the different reporting requirements across the world? Because there's a lot of difference in what's happening with certain countries around the world where we operate. We may be US-based companies, but we have entities that exist everywhere. So is CISA collaborating with other entities outside of the United States to understand what their requirements are, so we can tie it together from a global company perspective?
yes, definitely we are. Jason actually just spoke at an international conference not too long ago. We've been doing a lot of this. We actually did, I was working with an incident response with an organization, and it was the first time I'd really kind of seen the European rules in effect. They have a plant in Germany, and with the German rules, they could not use their forensics team that was based here in the United States to access and do forensics on their German plant. They had to actually call a German forensics company to come in and do forensics. All that data had to stay within the German borders. And so training and awareness for we preach it when we come on site to you, is do you know what your IT staff, what your cybersecurity staff, the training and awareness they should have, and that includes international laws and all the different places that you operate, you know, especially if you have plants like in China, Russia, the Ukraine, or any of those other hotspots across the country, is knowing how they operate, what their culture is like, and what the threat that is to the organization, and making sure that you're doing network segmentation, proper encryption where encryption is allowed, because certain countries allow it, certain countries don't. So there's a lot to keep up on there, so you need to make sure that your cybersecurity team is trained in those areas. Mark?
Yeah, hello, Richard Roque. Yeah, I have a question about multi-factor authentication, and what's your thoughts around that? I mean, that seems to be all the rage right now of you know, for preventing security breaches, but is that the long-term solution, or is that just a...
I don't think there ever is a long-term solution. It is the tool in your toolkit. As Jason already talked about, you know, that they are looking at a cyber attack for that. Now, I'm going to tell you that it's not just a tool in your toolkit, it's how you implement it. I'm going to tell a quick story, and Jason's probably going to groan because he knows how my stories go. I worked with an organization, and they had implemented multi-factor authentication about a year ago, and they were telling me this story, saying, hey, we implemented multi-factor authentication because we were hit with a ransomware attack. So, and we figured out that we could stop the ransomware attack if we did this multi-factor authentication. And then 3 months later, we got hit with ransomware again. We're like, man, how did the ransomware get in? So we cleaned everything up. We realized that it was the chief of security, the physical security, that the compromise came from. So they talked to him, everything, they got everything cleaned up. 3 months later, they got hit again. Once again, from the chief of securities. And they're like, how does this keep happening? He's like, I don't know. He's like, every time my phone beeps and says you're logging in, I say, okay, okay. So it's not just about implementing it, it's making sure your people are trained in what you actually do with it and how to actually use it. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I have a question. Is this on? Yeah. I'm Mark Duck with Shell. There's a lot of standards out there, and we use standards to kind of base our internal standards on for OT security. In one area of the business, we're working with a lot of suppliers, and we want them to have good OT security. It would be useful if there was some sort of certification against a standard that we could say, we don't have to do the assurance that, okay, because you have this certification against some reasonable standard, that would be good enough for us to do business with them, and we feel like the risk for OT security is being managed. Is there something like that? Is that a viable option to have some kind of certification against some kind of standard? Is there any thoughts on that?
So there is the last time I heard, when I was at the Honeywell conference recently, they were talking about, and I'm going to get this completely wrong, and I apologize because I didn't study before I got up on stage. It's the IEEE, there's a new cybersecurity standard or OT security standard coming out from IEEE, and I don't remember the number, but I can make sure that Sid and all of them get that. But I'm hearing that there's going to be some auditing around that standard. But right now, it's just going to be voluntary once again. But from the federal government standpoint, we're always going to push the NIST standards as much as we can. But once again, if everybody does it on their own, then there won't be a need for regulations. But yes, I can see in the future and say that at some point, there's going to have to be a minimum set of standards in order to operate on the internet.
Not just a standard, but some kind of certification. You'd say, it wouldn't be mandatory. It would be nice to have, where I don't have to do the assurance, somebody else.
And that's, you as the consumer can push that, is saying, looking at your vendors and your suppliers saying, hey, if you want to work with me, I want you to meet a minimum set of security standards. But since every company operates differently, because we do that in the federal government, we have to do authorization to operate, ATOs. But those are snapshots in time. 2 months later, if I put a new system online or if I change something, then that my ATO is suddenly, it's already outdated. It's a lot of work to keep that up to date. But yes, it is a great thing to have, and it's done wonders in the federal government to make sure that we're always on top of security as best as we can be. So, but that's not something we as a federal government are going to push at this point in time. That's something that the industry needs to get together and say, this is what we want and this is how we want to do it. I mean, that's what the chemical inspection group did, is actually that the chemical inspection standards are set by the companies, not by the federal government. So it is a great thought, and I hope that it comes around, but it's not something we're pushing.
So there is a standard and there is a certification scheme. So the standards are 62443. They're referenced by the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and we've been doing certification for automation and control systems for 10 years now. So it's all been voluntary, but it does exist. We're certifying components, we're certifying systems. We just launched an IIoT device and gateway certification over Christmas, and this year we're standing up a certification for the site installed systems, the as-built systems. So that'll take about a year to put together.
So I'm familiar with that, and if I'm talking about as an end user, cybersecurity program, so like Part 2.1, if there was a certification in Part 2.1.
Right. Yeah, so it's the International Society of Automation. That's where the 62443 standards are developed and published. And I run the conformity assessment scheme, and we certify to those standards. But the 2-1 standard that you're talking about is the latest in the batch of standards. So we'll also be doing the system integrator standard 2-4. So we're looking for supporters for that this year, actually. But we've got some funding, and we're looking for more people. and especially end users, because we look for a balance of stakeholders in developing these certifications. So, but this is all voluntary.
62443, you can hook them up in the back of the room. So thank you very much, Jason. I very much appreciate you allowing us to come and talk to you today.
Thank you, Jason.